Cool. Thanks for the intro. I'm really excited to be here and talk about something that I've been working on over the past 2 years throughout my research through my work in reverse engineering some of these card skimmers for various retail clients. Okay, so to start, let's do a brief agenda. We're going to talk about what's the big deal, why am I still talking about card skimmers in 2025 when this has been an issue for decades now at this point, talk about the anatomy of a skimmer attack, how we can find these devices, the objectives that our clients are looking for us to perform when we get on these engagements, the methods that we use to analyze these devices, cloning cards and how the criminals do it, and then finally some closing thoughts. Okay, so to give some background, as Tim Starr introduced me, I work for IBM X-Force Red. I'm a hardware hacker, although over the past 2 years, I've become our card skimmer subject matter expert. So last month, I actually presented at the Food Industry Association's Asset Protection and Grocery Resilience Conference with some similar material. So there was a lot of retailers that were more interested in the business outcomes of how to prevent these devices from being installed in their stores. And then additionally, I was invited to the Secret Service's SAPTA working group last month after that event, and that is their skimming and payment terminal attack group. So that's a group of a few dozen investigators, retailers, and I was actually the only industry SME there that we got to work on some devices hands-on, share information, collaborate on these devices and how they work. So my background's in computer engineering, so I love hardware, so I always love coming to hardwear.io. Never thought I would be speaking here when I first started volunteering a few years ago. And all this research has been done out of my home lab, so I don't have fancy $1 million lab equipment like the Secret Service do. Okay, so some questions for the audience. How many have seen skimmers before, if any? Okay, some people. So skimmers are devices that capture swiped cards. They've been around since the 1990s, and they're relatively simple to develop. How many have seen shimmers, if any? Okay, some people. So these are devices that steal chip cards payment data. They started appearing in the U.S. around 2015 when EMV chips started to be implemented, and these are relatively more complex than skimmers are. So my research has mainly focused on point-of-sale skimmers like these devices that you might see here. So point-of-sale devices being payment terminals that you might see within a retailer's store. So I've looked at over 110 skimmers for point-of-sale devices at this point. Only seen one shimmer in my time analyzing some of these devices, and this talk will mostly be covering physical skimming devices rather than something like e-skimming, which happens online. Okay, so to get into the consumer impact, the FBI estimates that more than $1 billion each year is cost from financial institutions and consumers due to skimming still in the modern age. So there's been a huge surge in these devices post-pandemic, and it really comes down to the fact that we still accept old technology in the form of magnetic stripe as a payment option. And of course, this means that the blame gets shifted between the banks, the card companies, the retailers, whoever accepts the mag stripe, who deploys the mag stripe, and of course, the legislative bodies, which still enable companies to use mag stripe for payment options. And of course, some fraud is accepted as a cost of doing business. So sometimes these devices get swept under the rug, or retailers don't really want to talk about them due to the fact that it's sort of that nasty side effect of doing business. So here I have a FICO infographic that you can see on the right side about some of the skimming statistics from 2024. And I would say the important thing to note here is the top 5 states that they have highlighted for skimming crimes in the bottom. So of course, California being by far one of the largest ones. And the next thing I'd like to point out is the pie chart you can see in the bottom right. This is judging bank versus non-bank ATM devices. And importantly, the non-bank devices make up the majority of, the non-ATM devices make up the majority of skimming victims. So this comes in the fact of point-of-sale skimmers are seen now more than ever. Okay, so brief breakdown on how a skimmer attack works. This applies to anything like a point of sale device, an ATM, a gas pump. These are the same sort of flow. So the criminals will identify potentially an outdated target. So in this case, this Verifone MX915 point of sale terminal has been around for over 15 years at this point, and is still used widely in retailers today in the U.S. So they'll select these outdated terminals where their skimmers might already be designed for them, maybe minimal surveillance if a store doesn't have cameras monitoring the checkout lanes. These devices are installed in seconds. So this device, if I can remove the facade, it's just a simple plastic facade overlay that the criminals can slap on, and once it's on, that's all that needs to be done for the device to be installed, at least on a point of sale device. And then once installed, the device will sit there potentially for weeks, capturing any victim's swiped cards before the criminals will come back periodically to retrieve the data and either resell it or use it themselves. Okay, so the root cause of this problem, again, like I mentioned earlier, is the fact that we still accept magnetic stripe as a payment option. So magnetic stripe being the actual swipe path on the back of a chip or a payment card. It's funny, I didn't expect Sammy to actually introduce this earlier today, but thankfully he actually gave some background on this. So there are physical magnetic bit paths or vertical swipes on that card that store the ones and zeros of the payment information. So this technology was actually invented by IBM in the late 1960s, and of course we're coming up on 60 years now of this being a technology, and at this point it's very obsolete, being used as a payment method. The data is stored unencrypted on the card, and all the information necessary to perform a swipe transaction is stored on the card apart from the PIN. So this data can be easily read. The technology has been around for so long now that these skimmers don't require any complex circuitry or programming to be able to read the data from a card. And important to note, EBT benefit cards, those being the cards that citizens, U.S. citizens on government benefits use, their primary payment method is magnetic stripe. So for the majority of states, they currently do not have chips or contactless payment options, meaning these skimming devices disproportionately affect citizens on government benefits. And that's something that we've seen when looking at data dumps from these devices, is that for some devices, over 50% of the cards captured are EBT benefit cards. And to give a brief overview of the data that's stored on the actual magnetic stripe, it's split between three what's called tracks. So there's track 1, track 2, and track 3. Track 1 stores the payment information like the card number, expiration date, service code, and then also the victim's name. Whereas track 2 stores just the payment information like the card number and expiration date. So some devices choose to capture just track 2 as that's the bare minimum required to clone a card, versus some devices that also capture track 1, meaning they'll capture the victim's name. Okay, so brief overview on how point of sale skimmers work. These are devices that, like I showed earlier, they overlay on the front of the actual point of sale terminal. They'll extend the swipe path to capture swiped cards by introducing their own magnetic sensor within that swipe path. So as you can see in the top left picture, you have their circuit board. You have a pin pad overlay that's used to capture your entered pin while also typing in the pin to the underlying pin pad on the point of sale device. These point of sale devices are battery operated. They'll save and store the data locally, and then for point of sale devices, all the devices that I've analyzed have been Bluetooth enabled, meaning that the criminals will retrieve the data wirelessly without having to remove the device and take it back to their lab. And of course, these devices conceal themselves based on the terminal that they're imitating. So I'll go into some device overlay variations, but oftentimes you wouldn't be able to spot the device unless you know exactly what you're looking for that specific point of sale terminal or ATM or what have you. So the biggest difference between these different device variations is the circuit board used, and that really ties it back to who's developing the device. There are several big device manufacturers that are responsible for the majority of these devices being created. And some of these devices require to be woken up with a magnet being passed over the front. So before the criminals can come back and dump the data over Bluetooth, a magnet might need to be passed over the front of the device, depending on the maker of the device, to actually turn on that Bluetooth to save power. And that also means that these devices aren't always broadcasting constantly over Bluetooth. Okay, so we'll talk about some different payment terminals and how skimmers affect them. So previously I've been talking about point of sale skimmers, as that's what I've been focused on. These are devices that are battery operated. They're an overlay onto the actual terminal themselves, and they use Bluetooth to exfiltrate data. So important to note, these point of sale terminals have anti-tamper features in them to prevent them from being opened up and modified, but these devices never trigger them as they're just a simple overlay on top. They don't have to modify any of the components of the terminal in order to capture your card information. So in contrast with ATM and gas pump skimmers, they can sort of branch out. There can also be overlays for gas pumps or ATMs, whereas a similar design, inserting your own pin pad or a pinhole camera, and then an additional, plastic facade onto the terminal can work. But there can also be what's called deep insert skimmers, which are devices actually inserted deep into the insert card path, and they require to be removed with a special tool, and they're not visible from the outside. So these can be a lot harder to detect than a simple overlay, which might present some, protrusions and what have you, versus a deep insert where, unless you have a special tool or investigating the inside of the card path, you'd never be able to spot it. And then finally, another very interesting device type that we've seen, not physically, sadly, but online, are internal skimmers. So some criminals will actually open up the gas pump cabinets with their special keys and install devices, as seen in the bottom right, that sit between the cables within the pump itself to sniff the data going over the wire, rather than having to add their own sensor or their own pin pad. They're just stealing it themselves from the pump itself. So these are very interesting because they leverage unencrypted communication going within the gas pump itself. And depending on, the device, they could use a pin pad overlay, or some ATM skimmers use pinhole cameras to watch the victim enter their PIN. Okay, so talking about point of sale overlay variations. The majority use this classic design where it's overlaid onto the lower half of the device. And again, this is for Verifone point of sale terminals. But the majority of terminals, they're somewhat similar. We've seen device variations that wrap around the edge of the terminal, and these can be harder to detect unless you know what you're looking for. We've seen two-part devices as well, one that fits within the pin pad and one that fits within the swipe slot. So these are a little bit more complex because the criminals need to pair to both of the devices to retrieve both the PIN information and the actual swipe information. And then finally, we have a PIN-only device, which overlays a PIN pad and then had a wire that wrapped around into the swipe path to capture the victim's swiped data. Okay, so briefly covering how do you spot a skimmer or a shimmer. I'm not going to be able to give you the confident knowledge to be able to spot any of these because, as I've described so far, it can be very difficult unless you know exactly what you're looking for on the specific type of payment terminal that you're using. So some of these devices have really slight issues, like, for example, the chip insert sticker on the point of sale terminal. The skimmers will have their own slightly different version of it, although it could be hard to detect if you're in a store. And then additionally, the biggest indicator of compromise that I've seen for these point of sale skimmers is the presence of an extra swipe slot on the actual terminal itself. So normally when you swipe a card on one of these devices, it will come out this hole in the front, whereas when the skimmer is installed, it comes out of an extra hole that they've created, and they sort of put a plastic facade hole there to make it look like the real terminal. So tugging on the reader and making sure there's no protrusions or, that it's not abnormal is always a good decision. Some suspicion is healthy when dealing with these devices, but skimmers on gas pumps and ATMs can be a lot harder to detect purely because they could be deep inserts or even internal. Okay, so moving on to how the industry detects these devices. So There's a few different ways that the industry likes to find these devices. There are some special devices like the first two, the Hunter Cat and the Skim Scan. These devices operate by actually reading the number of magnetic readers in the swipe path. So on a normal terminal, there's just one reader that captures your card, that of the legitimate payment terminal. But with a skimmer, like the point of sale skimmers, they'll add their own magnetic reader, which means that there'll now be two readers in the swipe path. So these devices basically use a specialized PCB to determine whether or not there's an additional reader in that swipe path, and therefore determine if there's a skimmer installed. Security tape has been around forever, and the criminals also have access to security tape, so it's not a very secure mechanism. If they can put the same security tape on, over top of their skimmer as you use, even if it's proprietary, they could remove it. And additionally, even if it is removed, sometimes the employees of the stores aren't actually trained to do anything about it when it is removed, or they don't end up doing anything about it. So not a very secure mechanism. And then finally, the bottom left shows the Target Easy Sweep. So this is a device that is a 3D printed clamshell, so it fits within the pin pad of several point of sale devices. And it's just this 3D printed device, so it fits within the chip slot. If there's no skimmer installed, it will fit no problem. If there is a skimmer installed, the pin pad overlay will actually raise the height of the pin pad, and then this device will no longer fit in. So this is a very easy, low-cost solution for retailers at scale to use, while also being easily usable by their employees with not much training. It either fits in or it doesn't. There's no technical knowledge required to use the device. Versus a device like Bluetooth scanners, like the one seen in the bottom right. That device, I believe, is $1,300, so you can't expect every retailer to go out and spend, over $1,000 in a Bluetooth scanner. There are some apps that do similar things, but overall, the Bluetooth scanners are looking for devices that they know are bad. They're looking for stuff they've already seen, and they can be less reliable for new devices or devices that aren't broadcasting constantly, like I mentioned before. If they're in a sleep state, then no matter what Bluetooth scanner you have, it's not going to pick it up. Okay, on to the fun stuff. So these are some of the circuit board variations we've seen for point of sale skimmers. So I believe we have 8 here. I've given some names to them just to make them easily referenceable. And of course, each of these different devices have a different storage format depending on who makes it. Some of these devices store their data encrypted, while others just do basic encoding. But all point of sale devices that we've seen use Bluetooth to retrieve the data. Some of these devices use off-the-shelf Bluetooth PCBs that they communicate via. So some of these devices, like the Alpha one, you can see that blue Bluetooth board on the front of the device, versus some more complex devices like the Batman devices or the Flash. They have their own Bluetooth chips where they implement their own more complex Bluetooth stack that talks to an app, versus the simple Bluetooth modules, which are just basic Bluetooth serial terminals. And just looking at the circuit boards, it's fairly difficult to tell where these devices are made without, knowledge of where the components are sourced. Although the one that I can say is the Zeta devices use Chinese microcontrollers and memory chips, so those data sheets are in Chinese. Somebody has to read Chinese to be able to develop that device, so I'm guessing it's not, an American. But our research has led us to being able to recover stolen cards from the majority of these point-of-sale skimmer variations, even sometimes the ones that use encryption. Okay, so briefly let's talk about why clients engage us to do some of this research. They're mostly looking for the attackers to be identified if there's any indicators of compromise that would lead to their identification. They're also looking for us to determine and potentially recover the data captured by these devices. So making sure that these devices aren't capturing data that they don't expect them to, or in some cases, companies are motivated by the fact that data breach disclosures are required when victims' names are captured, but not when just their payment information is captured. So if some devices capture track 1 data, they're more likely to care about those devices and be required to disclose a data breach. And of course, reducing the time to detection of some of these devices. So here I've created a map on where some of the different device variations that we've seen show up across the US. And of course, this is biased towards the retailers that we work with, but you can sort of get an idea of where some of these devices might, live, or where the gangs that buy them and install them might be from. So you can sort of build the picture around the top hotspots for these devices. And of course, here in California, we are one of them. Okay, moving on to data extraction. So these skimmers are relatively simple devices. They use simple microcontrollers. They have a magnetic decoding chip to interpret the data captured from the swiped card. And then the majority of these devices use an external flash memory chip. So this makes it easy to do chip-off extraction. We just remove that memory chip. We can mount it on a breakout board or either use a chip clip, though a lot of these devices use extremely tiny 2 by 3 millimeter UDFN chips. So these are really tiny. There are chip clips for them. I wish I had one. So I've probably soldered over 60 or 70 of these chips onto breakout boards. And as you can see on the right side, that's a grain of rice next to the chip. So getting all those contact points to be well soldered every time is a pain in the ass. So not my preferred method anymore, but it is a method that does work to get you the data from the memory chip. So once we have the data from the memory chip, it'll be in the form of a very basic binary dump. There's no file system. So in the case of a lot of these devices, they store their data just XORed onto some character walks. So they'll have a hexadecimal value starting from 0 all the way up to FF in a 256 byte page for each card record. And then the actual card data captured by these devices will be XORed onto that character walk at specific locations. So these devices will have anywhere from a 2 megabyte to 8 megabyte memory chip. So being that each card record takes up 256 bytes, one device could easily hold over 8,000 cards without, exceeding their storage. Though in our investigations, most of the devices that we've seen have captured anywhere from a few dozen cards to a few hundred for one skimmer. Okay, now on to the fun stuff, firmware extraction. So after we've retrieved the data, I want to go further. I want to understand how these devices work, potentially even talk to the Bluetooth of these devices. But just connecting with them doesn't really give you much. We need to understand how they operate in order to properly communicate with them. So using some PC byte probes, I'm able to connect to the debugging ports of the microcontrollers. And of course, several of these devices leave their microcontrollers unlocked. So if all the devices were locked, we would have to do some sort of glitching, which I haven't gone into yet. But luckily, the criminals aren't smart enough to lock down all their devices. So just having one device unlocked from a specific device variation is enough for us to get firmware from it. And then the majority of that code is shared between the different devices of that specific device variation. So using OpenOCD and a Tigard, which is my preferred little hardware hacking device, we can speak SWD to these EFM32 microcontrollers and retrieve their firmware, assuming that they're unlocked. Okay, moving on to firmware reverse engineering. So these devices, say the EFM32 microcontroller, it's an ARM Cortex processor. So you can throw that in Ghidra. Little Endian, it'll interpret it fairly well, but what you won't get is the actual memory mapped peripherals where, say, the location of the UART is within the memory map of the device. So you'll have a bunch of pointers to locations in memory which don't make any sense unless you go and reference the data sheet and say, what is this address in memory? Oh, it's a memory mapped UART interface. And that is a pain in the ass to have to do to all these addresses. So I was jumping down the rabbit hole hoping that I didn't have to write my own, plugin to load these, chips themselves, load all the memory mapped peripherals. Thankfully, a nice guy, Thomas Roth, sitting right there, has written a Ghidra plugin called SVD Loader. So this plugin will take what's called a system view description file for the specific microcontroller, and that file contains the memory mapped peripherals. With the plugin, you can load that into Ghidra, and then it will auto-populate all of those addresses to be able to point them to the correct location of, say, the UART peripheral. So that helped me greatly in the decompilation process to actually understand what the code is referencing and what it's doing. The best part of this firmware reverse engineering, or the simplest part, would be looking at the strings present in the file. So on the right side, you can see some of the strings from one of these firmware files. The first string is the most important. That's usually the passcode that's required to be entered within the Bluetooth serial terminal of the device. And then we have some Bluetooth startup commands sent to the module, and additionally some commands that can be run over the Bluetooth serial interface, doing stuff like checking the flash chip, setting the time, erasing the chip, locking the chip, dumping the data, and so on. So now that we have this information, we can finally move on to actually talking to the skimmers like the criminals would over Bluetooth. So the majority of these devices, like I mentioned earlier, just use simple Bluetooth serial terminals to communicate. So this is very basic send and receive commands. So with a Bluetooth serial terminal, we can connect to the devices. Most of the devices don't require a pin to pair over Bluetooth, although if they do, it's usually found within the firmware. So once we're connected, we can enter that pin that we found within the firmware, and this pin is often shared between different devices within the same variation. And we can run some commands, say the flash command, which gives us some information about the chip. And then, funnily enough, on this skimmer, the alive command returns "get rich or die trying," so some 50-cent influence there. And then finally, as you can see on the right, the dump command on this specific skimmer will spit out all of its card records, the pin number that was captured, the time it was captured, and then the actual track data captured by the device. So this is the same method that the criminals would use to pair to these devices. So rather than having to do chip-off extraction and do all this manual analysis, we can talk to these devices the same way that the criminals would. Okay, so now that we've covered skimmers, before we get into some card cloning, I want to cover how shimmers work. So this is an aspect of research that I'm not as familiar with, having only seen one of these devices, but it is something that is still common in today's world, but less common than skimmers. So shimmers work by using shim between the card and the reader. So when you insert your chip card, it makes contact with that chip reader, and the shimming devices will actually insert themselves in between that, and they actually steal the power from the chip reader themselves. So the chip reader is what powers your chip card to actually boot up and make those cryptographic, transactions. And that also works for the shimmer, is it will steal power from the terminal as well. And these devices don't actually clone the EMV chips in their entirety. Most modern EMV chips use crypto processors and asymmetric key pairs, so it's not as simple as reading your chip and cloning everything on it, but rather they steal the magnetic stripe data that's stored within the chip. So these chips still store the same track data on the magnetic stripe that's also stored within the chip, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. And then for the device that we did see, the data was retrieved via a special inserted card rather than Bluetooth, as these devices require the reader to be giving power out in order for them to be on. Okay, so talking about EMV chips. So EMV is the payment method or the standard created by Europay, Visa, and MasterCard during the 1990s. And this was to combat the rise of skimming fraud that was beginning in the 1990s as a more modern way of doing cryptographic, signing and transactions. So there's two main cardholder verification methods that we care about. There's chip and pin, and there's chip and signature. So chip and pin is where you're required to insert your card and also enter your pin in order to authorize the transaction. So this is primarily used overseas and by debit cards in the US. And chip and pin is more secure than chip and signature, which is used by credit cards in the US, which you only require to insert your chip and maybe give a signature, but there's no additional validation, say like the pin is used. So there are different cardholder verification methods, and an important thing to note is that the terminal and the card must agree on the cardholder verification method to use. So there is this so-called priority list where they start at the most secure and they keep dropping down until they find one that they can agree on. And some payment terminals are what's called offline, where they're not always connected to the internet. So some of the online cardholder verification methods can't be used in that case, and they fall back to less secure offline methods. So some of the criminals can abuse this when they're creating their own cloned cards by finding terminals that are offline, not connected to the internet, and then potentially exploiting a weaker cardholder verification method rather than exploiting the more secure online ones, which use that asymmetric key pair to do a cryptographic handshake. So older chip cards would use static data authentication, versus newer cards, like I mentioned, have crypto processors, which use dynamic data to do that cryptographic handshake. And of course, with all these different payment processors across the world, different point of sale systems, ATM systems, it's a really complex landscape with different configurations for each part of the process. And it leads to criminals being able to exploit certain misconfigurations on some terminals that might not be present across all of them. So here, not to humble brag, but I actually took that picture up close of that chip card. So that's the actual silicon die on the reverse side of an inserted chip card. And you might just be able to see those really fine wires at the bottom of the die. Those are actually connecting to the pinout of the chip itself within that epoxy coating. And another thing to note about these EMV chip cards, the chip is also what's used in contactless transactions. So it's the same crypto processor that's spoken to when the card is tapped. Okay. So nearing the end here, we're going to talk about how these criminals use their stolen cards now that we've gotten the card data. So they use this data to create cloned cards. So an important thing to note is that the data stored on a mag stripe does not contain that value on the back of the card that's required to be entered in an online transaction. So they're called card verification values or card security codes. They have a bunch of different names. What we care about is that there's 3 of them. There's one stored within the mag stripe itself. There's one written on the back of the card, which is required to be used in online transactions. And then there's one actually internal to the chip itself. So without that value on the back of the card, they can't make those online transactions. So what do? They clone it onto blank mag stripe cards, like with one of these readers here, which anybody can buy off Amazon. And they write these cards, and then they can use those cards to perform in-person swipe transactions with the stolen data. And that's not the only method. So these criminals can also make cloned EMV chip cards that can pass that offline verification. So they won't be able to pass the more secure method of online verification with that cryptographic handshake. But allegedly, some of these criminals are able to exploit offline point of sale or ATMs to trick them into thinking that their cloned EMV card is legitimate enough to authorize a transaction. So again, terminals with security misconfigurations are exploited in this context. And again, so these cards are used potentially to withdraw cash from an ATM, or we've heard stories of criminals buying large amounts of diesel fuel at gas pumps with stolen cards to then resell for cash. Okay, so moving on to reading cards. So this is what's called an HID OmniKey. It's a chip reader. So these readers can be bought for less than $20, and this is able to interface with chip cards and read the data from the chip. So on the right, I have a screenshot of the program called CardPeek, which is able to talk to the chip and enumerate the information off of it. Importantly to note, all this data can be read without the chip ever requiring the PIN. So you don't have to type in the PIN for this data to be enumerated. And like I mentioned previously, the chips still hold the magstripe equivalent data. That's what they call it, magstripe equivalent data. So a shimming device can come along, talk to the inserted chip card, and retrieve that magstripe data without the victim having to enter their PIN, or without them having to sort of clone the actual private key of the EMV card or break that cryptography. So leveraging this misconfiguration, that data can be retrieved from the chip and then also burned onto a magstripe card and used in swipe transactions. And an important thing to note is that that card security code on that magstripe equivalent data within the chip is different than the one on the actual magstripe of a real magstripe card. The problem is that not every payment processor properly validates that that code is actually the same one on the magstripe. So again, we get into the misconfigurations where these criminals can exploit the fact that maybe the payment processors aren't doing their due diligence to verify that the payment information is actually correct. So this magstripe equivalent data stored on the chip will have the same primary account number, the same expiration date, but a different verification code. Okay. Lastly, let's talk about cloning cards. So with these cloned cards, more and more we're seeing a shift away from magstripe within the U.S. as, like I said, it's an outdated payment form. But these criminals can abuse what's called magstripe fallback. So this happens when criminals can deliberately make a terminal misread a chip, say by inserting a card without a valid chip or covering it with a piece of tape. If you do that enough times, some terminals will prompt you to swipe your card because the chip can't be read. So this is what's called magstripe fallback. So they can abuse that by using those cloned swipe cards to make a swipe transaction, whereas normally a terminal would say, hey, you need to insert your card. And like I mentioned earlier, some of the offline terminals can be fooled by EMV clones, whereas they clone that static data enough to pass offline verification, but not online verification. And of course, the fraud liability shift that happened in 2015 moved the liability on whoever enables the magstripe transaction to happen. So whether it be the issuer of the card that still supports magstripe, or the merchant accepting the magstripe transaction, the blame gets shifted between them, and whoever supports the weakest link is the one who has to foot the bill when this fraud happens. And of course, like I mentioned previously, the card security codes that are supposed to be used to authorize these transactions are not always verified by the payment processors. So that can be another weak point in the payment processing chain. So finally, we're getting into my latest research, which has been on some EMV chip cloning software. So there's software like the X2 EMV all-in-one software. So this is criminal software that claims to be able to write and clone EMV chip cards. And from what I've seen, it's doing that offline static data authentication, which can be easily replicated. They claim to be able to pass online verification, but most of these claims are marketing gimmicks to get you to buy their software rather than actual real features. So of course, everybody selling this software is themselves a scammer, so you'll get scammed by the scammers. But of course, maybe that's not so bad that the scammers are scamming other scammers. And of course, a lot of the software itself is included with malware because, again, it's criminal software. So you can never trust these people. So some closing thoughts. It's a very large problem, skimming is, with numerous parties, with retailers, payment processors, banks, legislative bodies. So it's not a simple solution. If I could give you a simple solution, it was get rid of magstripe, let's throw it out tomorrow and the world would be a better place. But of course, with EBT cards, our legislation is slow to implement chips into these cards. So as such, people on government benefits are left using an insecure payment method to pay for their groceries. And as a result, these criminals end up stealing money, not only from those citizens, but from the governments. When the government reimburses these citizens, that money is basically then taken again by the criminals. So fast detection of these devices often leads to prevention. So if the criminals aren't having success installing these devices in your store because you're discovering them fast, they'll switch to the next store down the road that might not be doing as thorough checks or might not be removing them as quickly. So magnetic stripe is the problem. If I can give you anything, don't swipe your card. Chip or contactless is the solution. There's an asterisk there because, of course, there are still misconfigurations and security measures that can be thwarted, and that's some of the research that I want to go deeper into. So some homework: have a healthy suspicion, compare the adjacent terminals around you, tug on the readers, whatever you have to do. And if you're super suspicious, just pay in cash or use chip or contactless. So I have an email there. If anybody has tips or wants to reach me about skimmers, then you can reach me there. So thanks for listening to my talk. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Great talk. Are there any questions? Would the target device be a good thing to keep in your back pocket just to bring to every store?
You could definitely, yeah. It's a little bit of a weird shape. You can crush it, but it's something that they provide the file to retailers that email them. So you could find it online, I believe, if you reached out to them. But yeah, you could definitely use this at point of sale terminals. It costs 13 cents to print. So yeah.
I was just curious if you've purchased any skimmers or shimmers online yourself, and the one shimmer that you did discover, how you came about to get that one.
If I had purchased any skimmers, I wouldn't tell you because I'm probably already on a list traveling with this stuff. So no, I have not. Some of the people from my company say, hey, is it a good idea if we can purchase one to have it as, sort of a showcase? But then we're going to end up getting scammed ourselves by the scammers because people selling the skimmers also end up being scammers and they might not ever send you anything. So no, I have not purchased them. The devices that I do analyze are from retail partners that we partner with. And that's the same case for a shimmer. It was a retail partner that found it within their store and then tasked us to analyze it because it was such a unique device. This was a few years ago. I couldn't tell you how they actually recovered the device. The shimmer was a pin pad overlay, so it still had that sort of overlaid pin pad, but instead of using a swipe slot, it was just inserted into that chip slot. So the same Target Easy Sweep device, this should pick up on that again because it's using a pin pad overlay. Yeah.
So, yeah, when you go into these engagements, I suppose law enforcement is involved and also the whatever security organization of the merchant. So can you tell me, have some info on, are they catching these people? Are they like, do you have like a profile or modus operandi or a typical like, are they repeat offenders? Have they been doing this for a long while?
Yeah. So we work with, I've met with the Secret Service and they do their own analysis with this sort of stuff. They are hungry to catch these criminals. I'm more just looking at the circuit boards and analyzing the data. But traditionally, these devices are made out of the country and imported in. So the actual makers of these devices are so far removed from the people installing them and using them that it's very hard to catch them when they're so far up the supply chain. A lot of these criminals are from Romania. So some of them, the Secret Service group tells me that some of the people that they've caught have only been locked up for less than they would have liked, and then they go right back out to making devices again to scam people. So not as of a happy ending as we would like. There are still a lot of these device manufacturers out there making these devices, and the actual person that installs them or uses them or buys them changes every month. Those people are the ones that get caught. Yeah.
On the map you shared, there were like different types of skimmers. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if every dot means only one single ATM or, can you see like a Macy's having like 10 of them installed? Like what is the ratio there?
Yeah, so this is just a general location that I've made from where devices were recovered. These could be from within the same store, or these could be from separate stores for different retailers. I'm not exactly sure on if the criminals choose to install multiple devices in a location or just one device at a time. Because again, the people buying these devices, they are often paying hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars for one of these devices to actually install it. So it's a much more valuable to them than the actual people making it up the supply chain.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
Few of the questions are killing me. So I did some of the research a few years back for the Secret Service for some of those deep insert skimmers. Mm-hmm. And I was kind of curious if you had run into some of the supply chain stuff that I did, because the skimmers themselves were pretty expensive. I did buy some of them.
Okay.
I have no problem saying that. But what we started finding was a licensing scheme that was employed on a lot of these deep insert skimmers, mm-hmm. where they kind of relied on somebody who got a loaner for that skimmer to install it. And the content would be encrypted on the smart card and returned, and they could get some of those cards back. I think they were allowed to get the first 4 cards back, unless they paid a licensing fee to get the rest back. I was kind of curious if you had seen anything like that.
Yeah, that definitely could be the case for some of the devices that encrypt their data. Some devices use special apps that remove the data. So of course that app could also be capturing all those cards that the end user is capturing themselves, while the person up the supply chain that made the device is also stealing all those cards. So yeah, hard to say how these criminals exactly use the devices. As I said, I'm a little bit disconnected from the law enforcement standpoint and more focused on the actual third-party analysis of the circuit boards.
All right, we have 2 more questions.
Just curious, when you put the overlay on top, does it mess with the payment transaction at all?
Yeah,
Or does
so
it go through as normal?
yeah, no, the transactions will go through as normal. Think of it as a parasite that wants to keep its host alive. If it would kill the host, then the parasite would die, right? So these skimmers have the incentive that they don't want to interfere with the normal transactions, or else some suspicion will be raised, and then the device might be detected.
Right, one last question. You had a question?
I'm just curious, is there any theory around the clustering of the different device types? It's like, it seems too organized.
Yeah, it definitely comes down to some organized crime of gangs that choose to buy these devices, and then oftentimes they'll have people that install the devices, separate people that come back to retrieve the data, and different people that actually go and spend the card's data. So there is some sort of organized crime around these devices.
All right. If you have more questions, please find Aidan around the conference later. He's not allowed to leave until he answered all of them. So please thank the speaker again.
Thank you.